Black America. John Lewis here again with X Known, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 7 of XCast, Voices of the Unforgotten. And today we'll be talking about Mary Ellen Pleasant, the woman who financed freedom. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. Picture this. It's the middle of the 1800s. San Francisco is exploding with noise, dust, and ambition. The gold rush has pulled people from every corner of the world, all chasing fortunes, land, power, and status. The city feels lawless, restless, and hungry. Most black people in America are still enslaved. Those who are free live with constant danger, exclusion, and limitation. Laws are stacked against them, and violence is always close. Opportunity is not for you. And inside that world, quietly, invisibly, almost impossibly, a black woman is becoming one of the richest people in the West. Not by standing in the spotlight, not by bragging, not by demanding recognition, but by listening, by investing, by positioning herself where no one thought she belonged, and by using her wealth as a weapon against every slavery and discrimination. Her name was Mary Ellen Pleasant. Some people tried to turn her into a stereotype. Some tried to turn her into a villain. Some tried to turn her into a joke. But history now tells us something very different. She was a strategist, a financier of freedom, a lawsuit warrior against segregation, a builder of wealth for her community, and one of the most dangerous women to the system that tried to erase her. This is her story. Mary Ellen Pleasant entered the world around 1814, and even that simple sentence reveals something about the world she was born into. Around, not exact, not certain, not clearly recorded. Because when black women were born in early 19th century America, documentation was not designed to preserve their precision. If born enslaved, their existence was often reduced to an entry in a ledger. If born free, their status could still be altered by migration, by law, or by accusation. Identity itself was unstable. There are competing accounts of her birthplace. Georgia, Massachusetts, possibly both through relocation. And that ambiguity is not unusual for someone navigating the fault lines of slavery and abolition. What historians do agree on is that she grew up during a period of intensifying national conflict over human bondage. The United States in the early 1800s was not passively divided. It was economically entangled in slavery while publicly debating its morality. Mary came of age during the expansion of abolitionist organizing in northern states. Churches, meeting halls, and private homes were becoming centers of anti-slavery coordination. Newspapers were circulating radical ideas. Networks were forming that would later become the Underground Railroad. Whether born enslaved and brought north or born free in the north, she would have grown up in proximity to both racial vulnerability and abolitionist resistance. This dual exposure mattered. She didn't encounter slavery as abstract cruelty. She encountered it as lived structure. She saw how black freedom could be revoked, challenged, or denied based on location and power. She also saw how abolitionist communities organized, raised funds, protected fugitives, and used law strategically. That early environment shaped her thinking in a specific direction. She didn't grow up believing injustice was random. She grew up observing that injustice was organized. And once you recognize that oppression is organized, the logical response is not simply outrage, it's strategy. By the time Mary reached adulthood, abolition was no longer a scattered moral complaint whispered in churches. It was an organized, coordinated movement with structure, roles, and operational discipline. And that structure is what matters. The Underground Railroad was not improvisation, it was logistics. There were conductors who guided escapees from one point to another. There were station masters who provided shelter. There were code systems embedded in songs and letters. There were lawyers prepared to challenge slave catchers in court. There were white allies who leveraged legal standing. And behind all of it, there were financial contributors. Freedom was expensive. Transportation cost money. Food cost money. Property for safe houses cost money. Printing anti-slavery pamphlets cost money. Legal challenges cost money. Bail, fines, bribes, all of it required funding. Abolitionist networks survived because someone was underwriting risk. Mary Ellen's early exposure to abolitionist communities in the North would have revealed the financial undercurrent beneath moral activism. She would have seen that sermons stirred hearts, but balance sheets sustained action. She would have recognized that safe houses did not operate on courage alone. They operated on mortgages, maintenance, and material resources. What distinguished Pleasant from many others was not simply her belief in abolition. It was her growing understanding that liberation required economic coordination. While some abolitionists became visible public voices, others moved strategically behind the scenes. Visibility attracted retaliation. Funding required discretion. Historical references link Pleasant to financial support of anti-slavery operations and to networks assisting freedom seekers. Some accounts associate her with John Brown's militant resistance. Whether every transaction can be traced line by line, the larger truth remains. She was moving in circles where money and resistance intersected. And she was learning that moral outrage without infrastructure fades. Learning that movements survive when someone pays the cost. Learning that strategy amplifies courage. She was not preparing to speak louder. She was preparing to build deeper. To understand Mary Ellen's strategic thinking, you have to understand the machinery she was observing. Slavery in the United States was not sustained merely by racial hatred or cultural bias. It was sustained by economic design. It was a fully integrated financial system embedded in national expansion. Enslaved people were not only laborers, they were assets. They were insured by insurance companies. They were listed as collateral in bank loans. They were transferred through estate settlements. They were bought and sold in markets that calculated projected productivity like livestock futures. Plantation owners borrowed against future harvests of cotton, tobacco, and sugar crops cultivated by forced labor. Northern banks issued credit secured by enslaved bodies. Textile mills in Massachusetts and New York depended on Southern cotton to maintain output. International shipping companies moved goods produced through slavery across the Atlantic. The profits didn't remain in the South alone. They circulated nationally. By the mid-1800s, the total monetary value of enslaved people in the United States rivaled, and in some years exceeded, the combined value of railroads, factories, and industrial infrastructure. Slavery was not a side system. It was central to American capital formation. Mary lived in a period when this reality was visible to anyone willing to examine ledgers instead of speeches. She recognized that if slavery was financially entrenched, then moral condemnation alone would not dismantle it. People defend what enriches them. Institutions protect what sustains them. So abolition required economic disruption. It required alternative capital flows. It required funding escape networks. It required financing legal resistance. It required building wealth outside the plantation model. Pleasant understood that oppression was stabilized through commerce. And once you recognize that injustice is monetized, the fight becomes strategic. You do not only argue, you invest. You counterweight. You redirect capital. She was not simply opposing slavery emotionally. She was studying its revenue model. When Mary arrived in California during the gold rush era, she was entering a society still under construction. This was not an established power structure with rigid general hierarchies. It was fluid. Institutions were being assembled in real time. Banks were forming. Railroad routes were being negotiated. Land claims were contested and recontested. Political alliances were transactional and unstable. That instability created danger, but it also created openings. Most people who rushed west were chasing gold in rivers and hillsides, but the real fortunes of the gold rush were not made by miners. They were made by those who built infrastructure around miners: boarding houses, restaurants, equipment suppliers, transportation networks, property holding near high traffic zones, railroads that moved ore and goods. The men who built these systems became the lasting power. Pleasant recognized this difference. She didn't chase extraction. She studied circulation. California's power structure was overwhelmingly white, male, and capital driven. But because it was new, wealth was still being redistributed rapidly. Property values fluctuated. Railroad speculation created opportunity. Hospitality businesses boomed as waves of fortune seekers arrived. The legal framework restricting black ownership was real, but enforcement varied, and partnerships can be structured strategically. By working inside elite households as a domestic employee, Pleasant gained proximity to private conversations. She observed how investors shared information before public announcements. She learned how businesses' alliances formed. She heard which neighborhoods were about to rise in value. She watched how rail expansions would affect real estate. This was education disguised as labor. She was studying not only who had power, but how power moved. In a developing economy, proximity to decision-making is leverage. She used domestic access to gather intelligence, and then she positioned herself in boarding houses, real estate, and investment channels that would appreciate as the city expanded. California was volatile, but volatility rewards strategy. And Mary was positioning herself as the structural level, not the surface. Mary didn't accumulate wealth accidentally. She constructed it deliberately, and her method reveals how carefully she studied the system that she was entering. Her early investments were not flashy. They were foundational. Boarding houses were among her first strategic moves. During the gold rush and its aftermath, boarding houses were high-demand properties. They served transient workers, business travelers, and investors moving through expanding urban zones. Boarding houses generated consistent cash flow. They required management skill, but they were less speculative than mining ventures. From there, she expanded into restaurants and hospitality businesses. These ventures thrived in cities experiencing rapid population growth. She understood demand patterns. She understood location value. She positioned businesses where traffic would naturally increase. Real estate became her anchor. Property ownership in an expanding city multiplies leverage. As infrastructure improves, land appreciates. As railroads connect districts, property becomes more valuable. She was investing not just in buildings, but in trajectory. Because discriminatory laws restricted black ownership rights, she formed partnerships, particularly with Thomas Bell. placing assets in legally safer names while maintaining influence behind the scenes. This was not submission. It was strategic camouflage. She used the legal system's blind spots to secure footholds inside markets that were not designed to include her. She also invested in railroad stocks and mining operations. Railroads were the arteries of the expansion. They determined which region prospered and which stagnated. By investing in transportation infrastructure, she was aligning her wealth with long-term growth rather than short-term speculation. Her strategy combined liquidity and assets. Cash flow from hospitality funded property acquisition. Property appreciation funded further investment. Diversification reduced exposure to collapse in any single sector. This was not reckless ambition. It was calculated positioning. And by the 1860s, she had built a fortune that translated into millions in modern value, an extraordinary achievement for a black woman in 19th century America. In 1866, Mary boarded a San Francisco streetcar and was forcibly removed because of her race. On the surface, it might appear as just another act of everyday discrimination in post-Civil War America. But this was not simply about humiliation. It was about public access, commercial rights, and citizenship status in a rapidly modernizing city. Streetcars were not casual conveniences. They were arteries of economic participation. They connected business districts to residential zones. They determined who could travel efficiently to work, to court, to commerce. Denial of access was not only symbolic exclusion, it was economic restriction. Mary understood that. When she was removed from the streetcar, she didn't treat it as an isolated insult. She treated it as a structural violation. She sued. Pleasant versus North Beach and Mission Railroad Company became one of the earliest successful racial discrimination cases in California. That timing is critical. The Civil War had ended only 1 year prior. Reconstruction policies were still forming. Federal civil rights protections were fragile and inconsistent. California, though a free state, still tolerated discriminatory practices embedded in transportation and public accommodations. The lawsuit challenged more than a single company. It challenged the assumption that private corporations could exclude black passengers without consequence. Winning that case meant forcing a corporation to publicly answer for discrimination. It meant establishing that racial exclusion in public transportation was not beyond legal scrutiny. It meant inserting black citizenship into a commercial arena that preferred segregation by practice, if not by statute. For a black woman to initiate and win such a case in 1866 was not common. It required resources. It required legal counsel. It required persistence. And it required confidence that the system could be pressured through its own mechanism. Mary didn't merely react emotionally. She applied leverage through law. As Mary's wealth grew and her influence became harder to ignore, scrutiny followed. Wealth itself can attract attention, but wealth combined with political alignment attracts hostility. A black woman building capital in a white-dominated economic structure was already disruptive. A black woman building capital while financing abolition and challenging discrimination was destabilizing. Newspapers began portraying her in ways that blurred fact and insinuation. Instead of being described as a disciplined investor, she was framed as manipulative. Instead of being acknowledged as a strategist, she was cast as someone exerting improper influence over white businessmen. The language used in reporting often carried racial undertones, exoticizing her, questioning her legitimacy, hinting at hidden motives. When Thomas Bell died, the legal foundation of our empire was tested because many properties were legally in his name due to discriminatory restrictions. ownership became contested. Lawsuits erupted. Extended litigation drained her finances. Years of court battles shifted attention from her financial skill to public controversy. This was not accidental friction. It was structural vulnerability meeting structural resistance. When capital accumulates outside the intended hierarchy, systems respond. They respond through regulation, through litigation, and through narrative control. The press became a mechanism for shaping public perception. If her reputation could be damaged, her credibility could be weakened. If she could be framed as scandalous, her economic authority could be questioned. Character assassination has long been used to neutralize powerful women, especially women of color. If competence cannot be denied outright, morality is questioned. If wealth cannot be disproven, legitimacy is attacked. Mary endured years of this pressure. Her fortune diminished under legal strain. Her public image was distorted. Yet even as litigation chipped away at her holdings, the structural imprint of her earlier investments and abolitionist fundings remained. The system could drain assets, but it could not erase precedent. What happened to Mary was not simply personal misfortune, it was a case study in systemic vulnerability. She had mastered capital formation. She diversified investments. She leveraged partnerships. She positioned herself inside expanding infrastructure. By all measurable standards, she played the economic game with discipline and foresight. Yet when pressure came, the structural protections surrounding her wealth were fragile. That fragility was not accidental. The legal system of the 19th century was not constructed to safeguard Black accumulation. Property laws, contract enforcement, and inheritance protections were unevenly applied. Black wealth could be built, but its defense mechanisms were limited. Partnerships often required white intermediaries, creating legal exposure. Courts could be influenced by racial bias. Media narratives could shift public perception before verdicts were even rendered. Capital without structural protection becomes vulnerable capital. Mary's experience demonstrates a pattern repeated throughout American history. Black entrepreneurs accumulate assets. Economic success grows. Then legal disputes, regulatory shifts, discriminatory enforcement, or reputational attacks erode holdings. Wealth becomes contested. Credit becomes restricted. Access narrows. This is not conspiracy rhetoric. It is historical pattern. When capital accumulates outside the dominant hierarchy, systems often recalibrate to contain it, sometimes through legislation, sometimes through market restrictions, sometimes through litigation fatigue. Mary's litigation battles drain not only money but time and energy. Extended court proceedings are themselves a financial strategy. Even if a case is eventually resolved, the cost of defense can exhaust resources. Legal warfare becomes economic warfare. Her story forces a critical recognition. Accumulation is only half the battle. Protection is the other half. Without structural safeguards, wealth can be undermined faster than it's built. Mary wasn't naive. She understood leverage, but she operated inside a framework that was never designed to protect her ascent. And that context matters. Mary's story does not end in the 19th century. It echoes forward. When she died in 1904, much of her fortune had been diminished through litigation and structural vulnerability. But wealth is not the only measure of impact. Infrastructure outlives headlines. Precedent outlives scandal. Strategy outlives distortion. Today, conversations about economic empowerment, generational wealth, ownership, equity, and financial literacy dominate discussions about community advancement. Yet, Mary was applying those principles under far more hostile conditions. She was building diversified income streams when black citizenship was barely recognized. She was investing in real estate when property rights were unevenly enforced. She was funding abolition when it carried federal risk. Her legacy is not just that she accumulated money, it's that she understood money as leverage. Modern movements often separate economic conversation from social justice conversation. They treat wealth as personal aspiration rather than structural tool. Mary didn't make that separation. She recognized that ownership influences law, that capital influences access, that funding determines endurance. She teaches that liberation is logistical. If safe houses require funding, someone must fund them. If lawsuits challenge injustice, someone must pay attorneys. If movements expand, someone must sustain the infrastructure. Mary was part of that sustaining layer. Her life also reminds us that wealth alone does not guarantee protection. Structural safeguards matter. Legal literacy matters. Narrative control matters. Reputation management matters. Economic strategy without defensive planning invites vulnerability. She left a blueprint. Study the system before entering it. Build diversified leverage. Deploy capital intentionally. Anticipate backlash. Protect your narrative as fiercely as your assets. History attempted to reduce her to controversy, but when examined carefully, her life reveals architecture, not accident. Mary didn't simply live in her time, she engineered within it. And that engineering still matters. They didn't teach you her name, but now you know it. And knowing it changes how you see what's possible. So go to xstone.com right now. Read the mission statement. Look through the Share the Knowledge page. Copy and repost that link because it's on us to share it because they won't. I say it again. Go to xstone.com right now. Read the mission statement. Look through the Share the Knowledge page. Copy and repost that link because it's on us to share it because they won't. And then wear the legacy. Let people ask you what that crest means and tell them. Tell them about Mary Ellen Pleasant. Tell them why her story still matters. Tell them we'll never forget. This is X-Known for the people they tried to erase but couldn't.